Good afternoon, this is Lee McWhorter. Welcome to the first video lecture workshop for the Cryptography and Access Management class that began a couple days ago on 6/25. This class is two parts, as you can tell by the name. The first 4 lessons are actually about cryptography, what it is, and kind of a tour through everything, and we'll go over that and all that today, as well as the first chapter, or lesson 5, which begins to get into the second part of the class, which is on access management. This material goes together well because, not unsurprisingly, when you do some kind of access control, some kind of login, right? You go to Amazon.com or something, and you get that nice little lock symbol and maybe a green indicator that you've got a nice HTTPS connection, right? So we've got SSL, TSL going on there. So we're going to learn about these different protocols and how this works. And so we're going to learn sort of the basics of encryption. We've been playing with some on and off. SSH, of course, is encrypted, and we've talked about some of these protocols up to this point, but this is our sort of a deeper dive into what encryption or cryptography is all about. And we will, like I said, cover those chapters today, lessons 1 through 4, and then we will also begin to introduce the access management concepts. And then next week we'll get more into the access management stuff, and as well as a few related things, including talking a little bit about risk management. We've talked about that before, but that's one of those topics all the way from the introduction class that keeps coming back again. So to begin for today, the first lesson talks about what cryptography is and some general concepts about how it relates to some of the things that we're trying to do. For example, if you go back once again to Intro to Security Foundations, we talked about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Well, those are our promises we make, right, in cybersecurity to our organizations that we work for or work with, to protect those things, to protect the confidentiality, to protect the integrity, and to protect the systems and data so that we can make it available for the organization to carry out its objectives. And so cryptography actually really definitely helps us in that area. But what is cryptography? Well, in a nutshell, it's taking what we call plain text, standard, readable, human readable message, for example, and then messing with it, coding it in some way, shape, or form so that we end up with something we call ciphertext. And then that ostensibly is, not human readable. And the only way that then, theoretically someone can reverse that is that they have the key. And so, you can think of, maybe this dates me a bit, and some of you in the program are too young to remember this, but think of like old Cracker Jacks or cereal boxes that used to come with like a decoder ring, and it would be a little ring with, or maybe it'd be a wheel, something that and you could spin it, and when you spun the different layers, you could line up on a letter, and it would give you an alternate letter or symbol, and then you would write that down. And then, of course, if your friend had that same secret decoder ring, then they could spin around and line up on those symbols and then get the appropriate letter and transcode the message. So at its most basic form, that's what cryptography is about. We somehow translate the plain text into some other, encrypted or ciphertext so that the message is obscure, right? And that ideally no one can figure out how to read that message unless they know the key that is in question. And of course, so, obviously you can start to understand that, one of the things we're supposed to do is keep data confidential. So if we can encrypt it, scramble it up on the system while it's being transmitted, which is what we're doing with SSH, right, or HTTPS, then we can keep that confidential, theoretically, right, as long as nobody can break the code and eavesdrop on the communication. And that's the idea. We know, we've already learned that you can, on a network, even without hubs, that there are many ways that you can, set things up with Wireshark and things like that, where you can capture packets or you can gain a lot of information and, about what's being transmitted over segments of a network. And of course, if that's not encrypted, sort of one of the reasons, obviously, that we don't use Telnet really anymore is because you're just looking in the package, you can see the username and password. Whereas SSH, those packets, if you look down in them, they're encrypted, the stream of data. And so that's, what we're trying to accomplish is to help our security. And obviously, if we can encrypt the communication so that no one can eavesdrop on it, and if no one can capture those passwords, no one can capture that confidential data, then yeah, this is a useful tool we want to use in cybersecurity. We use it in different places. Obviously, we can encrypt data, say, on the hard drive. We can encrypt it in transmission. Remember, we have to protect data in all of its states, and we'll see that come up and be referenced again in this chapter, in this lesson. And so then, obviously, from the point of view of integrity as well, one of the things that we can do with cryptographic kind of analysis and cryptologic techniques is that not only can we maintain confidentiality, scrambling that stuff up before we send it so no one can understand what it is, but especially as we're going to learn with some of the more modern techniques that we use, we can actually also do a degree of validity, verification. When we make that connection with Amazon and the browser and the server start to talk to each other and they exchange their information so that they can set up that encrypted communication, one of the things that happens, generally speaking, unbeknownst to most users, is behind the scenes, is your browser makes a request to the server answers back and says, here's my certificate. This is who I say I am Amazon.com, or I'm abcbank.com, or whatever the case may be. And in the background, what happens, and usually you only see this when there's a problem. Maybe you have been surfing to some site somewhere and it's come up with a message that says the certificate's not done right, or the certificate's it's out of date, or it's signed for a different name. Because this is really kind of to be done correctly, it's all a cryptographic process. And so what happens is that your browser then takes that digital signature it's received from ostensibly Amazon.com, and then it uses the ability to check out with the various provider, whoever provided Amazon their SSL certificate, and checks against that, because it will be digitally signed by that individual to say, yes, we verify that we have verified that we issued that certificate to that IP, to that computer, to that company. And depending upon the level of encryption, they may have, literally called and done an audit, or whatever the case is. There's different layers of those certificates you can buy. But what they do is that third party then very quickly in the background, your browser says, oh, okay, that is Amazon. I trust it now. I've verified it with VeriSign or Network Solutions or GoDaddy or whoever issued the certificate. I've verified it against theirs, and it's all digitally signed. So mathematically, we're going to trust that. And then we can say, okay, let's exchange keys and let's set up our, our secure communication. And so there's different types of encryption, as the first chapter talks about. In the oldest school, there was just sort of a single key. And you could think of this as like those Cracker Jack decoder rings, or any type of pattern like that, where basically the idea was, we could share that key in advance, and then, as long as the people who know that key and keep that little, transformation secret, then they can decode the messages, and ostensibly no one else can. And so the lesson ends by talking about arguably one of, at least documentably, one of, if not the, earliest form of some kind of cipher like this, and it's called the Caesar cipher, because it was used back during that time. And it was a means for Caesar to be able to communicate with his generals out in the field in the far-flung Roman Empire, and ideally not have to worry that, any messenger carrying that message was reading every word of it along the way, or if it got stolen, and captured by a spy, then the enemy would know what his movements were. And so they came up with this methodology to basically, simple enough, it's just offset the alphabet. And so we can think of it, and there's a whole version, a bunch of them, and as we move into lesson 2, you actually see that there are a number of them, the Caesar and the Vinge, or Vingere, however that's pronounced, Vinjarer, I think is the best I found out. I was trying to figure out that gentleman's name, the Vigene with an accent, R-E, Visionaire is how I actually figured is the best pronunciation of that name, and Caesar. And these are variants of these transformation ciphers, and they're substitution ciphers in the sense that when you look at the words you're gonna offset, that you're going to encode and turn into some kind of ciphertext. And what you do is you offset the letters within the alphabet. So if we do like a 4 offset, then an A becomes a 1, 2, 3, 4 would make it a D, or a 3, or whichever case, wherever you're starting your base from, a D or an E. And so basically then that's what you write down in the message. And so if I know that, we're all agreeing, say our class is going to agree that we're going to submit homework with secret messages. I had even considered that, and technically you do have to do some ciphers and play with some things, but we didn't end up making it necessarily completely turn in homework encrypted per se. But nonetheless, we could have. Let's say we did that. So we agree, okay, we're going to use 5-letter offset or whatever on the alphabet, and then you folks could encode your messages, code your homework, send it to me, and then I would know to be able to do that. Now, of course, there's a few weaknesses with these, and there's a number. They go on to talk about, some of the additional and symbols, and we'll come back to them. But these early just substitution ciphers, they have a couple weaknesses, of course. One is that if somebody gives up the key, then it's really easy. So if you, capture a general or torture somebody, you're overhear the key being whispered, hey, use a 4 offset, and then somebody else overhears that, so now they know that, oh, okay, I can break this message just by offsetting the letters in the alphabet. So that's one weakness, of course, that this key has to be pre-shared, and we have to somehow communicate the code in the encoding mechanism effectively, and that can be a security risk or a potential breach. The other more really problematic with these early keys, and it was something that as a kid I actually got really kind of into, I'll admit, I from things like, whether it be, the Hardy Boys kind of things as a kid, or mystery novels, and I was really into puzzles and riddles, and I got drawn into some of this for various reasons, and it's actually kind of fun because you can do this yourself, and you're going to in your exercises to a degree, but you can with just about any type of basic substitution. You can actually break them by hand. They're actually pretty easy to do if you have a fair enough amount of text to work with, say a paragraph or two of text, because what you need to do is what's something called frequency distribution or frequency analysis. And what you need to do to look at your encrypted ciphertext, and you're assuming it is a substitution, or it's a substitution of some kind. Then we know that whatever these symbols are, they could be letters, as we're going to see. There's other algorithms we could use. They could be special symbols, whatever. It doesn't really matter what, at the end of the day. It may look totally different than just letters offset. It could be special, symbols, whatever, hieroglyphics, arguably. But if you're assuming that each of these represents a letter, if it is a substitution cipher, then all you need to do is basically count up all the symbols. And the odds are that the symbol on that page that has the highest frequency is probably the letter E. And so when you look, and we talk about this, and there's even a chart in the lesson, but the 5 most common letters, at least in the English language, are E, T, A, O, and I. Mostly vowels, with the T thrown in there, right? But that's hugely powerful to know. And so, assuming normal wording, normal average distribution of wording and lettering, that the substitution ciphers are going to show that same distribution for whatever symbols. So technically, the highest count symbol on the page is likely the E, it could be the T, but you begin to start looking based on this frequency distribution, and that the highest 2 or 3 or 5, 5, 10 symbols are X, are these symbols. And then you look at the actual, content of the message all scrambled up, and so you start matching up. So if you see, for example, that there is a letter, there's a 3-letter word here that ends with that symbol that you think is the most common symbol, and so we're assuming it's an E, then if that's the case, we can probably assume that the other 2 symbols are T and H, right, for the. There could be a few other possibilities if somebody had hyphenated, something like pre in front of, or, anyway, there's possibilities that there could be other things, but you get the idea. A two-letter word, that ends in that symbol that we think is the E, then it's probably a B, and for the word, B, the E. And so we can be, or it could be ME, right? It could be me. But the idea is that as we begin to figure out some of the words, then we have other characters. And so we go and we substitute, so we take that, whatever that symbol is, we think is the most common one, and we go substitute it for E everywhere throughout the text. And then we, assuming that works, because we could be off, it could be slightly, maybe our count, just because of the wording that's actually in this, maybe the most common symbol is actually the T, and the E is going to be the second. So you kind of have to play with it a little bit, do some manual substitutions in there, and try. But like I said, you're looking for those kind of patterns where there's easily ways for us to make a word. So, a three-letter word that ends in an E, a two-letter word that ends in an E. These words, these smaller words, help us begin to break the code. And then you can go further than that. Obviously, O is one of the top 5 letters. And so if you see a two-letter word beginning with an O, then you very likely have an of, or an on, or an or, right? And this gives you chances. And of course, by correlating other words you're starting to put together, you finally just undo the substitution manually. The most common counts, the most frequent symbols in that code are likely to be those 5 letters, give or take. And then once you've mapped those in, and you could then start to break other words, because you know that, okay, that's going to be an or, an if, an or an on, or an of. And so you figure it out by trial and error. And then, of course, it'll make sense that if you know that now as an end, then it'll fit in other words and help you complete other words. And you just keep filling in until you're left with only a handful left. And the most, there'd be some letters like maybe Z or X or something you may not even have on the page, because they're some of the least common letters, right, in the English language. And then, of course, you're going to be able to just pick out the last ones that you have left, because you're going to be able to complete those words. It's almost like playing Scrabble. You got everything but this last, there's only so many words I can make with that blank there, so I now know what that symbol means. And then, ideally, you totally decrypted the entire message by hand. And I used to do this a lot as a kid, both to solve puzzles or riddles in stories or in books, novels that I was reading, escapist children's literature, whatever, getting into things like fantasy and sci-fi, and running into additional puzzles and riddles and codes. And then, of course, as a kid, very, very young kid, grade school or whatever, it wasn't uncommon to pass notes around in class. And of course, learned about that, used the codes ourselves. So ideally, if we did get our note taken up, then the teacher wouldn't go up in front of class and read our note and tell that Billy likes Susie or something and get us all embarrassed, right? So we used codes, and other people started to adopt that. And so I was just really big into codes and languages and all kinds of things. Even at that same time, I guess I was in kind of a troublemaking class. I don't think I was a troublemaker, a little bit of a prankster maybe, but nonetheless, I remember a period in school where we got told that we couldn't talk in the break room anymore. And so a couple girls that were sitting across from each other, they'd set us boy, girl, and no talking for the first semester. We were in trouble, no talking in the lunchroom. And so they were doing all this stuff, and they were really just doing single hand sign language, which I've since learned, and I learned it right then because I wanted to know what the heck they were saying. And so I went home and learned sign language, and then came back, and over the course of the next semester, I mastered it, figuring out what they were saying all the time. And then I, of course, actually had an insight into who liked who and all kinds of silly stuff, within the school infrastructure. So there's all kinds of codes. Once you go beyond those basic ciphers, people realized that was the problem. Somebody given enough time, which really didn't take a whole lot, but if they had enough context, multiple messages to work with, or longer text, paragraphs, they could start to break codes by hand. And so people started coming up with other kinds of ways, to do the offset. So we have things like the rail fence or zigzag cipher. I'm not going to go through all these. You can read it and see the examples in the book. The pig pen, which is a really neat little symbol-based cipher. So at first glance, it looks like, what in the heck is this? There's these dots and lines and various things. And it's a real neat little encryption. But at the end of the day, it's still a substitution cipher with something equaling a letter. And so off you go trying to crack that one. We started to basically, try to decide to do other things. And as the world moved on, and so we go through history, we start running into things like how the Germans built the Enigma machines to be cryptography machines, which took another machine basically and Alan Turing to basically break that code during the war. And even to the creation during sort of the Cold War days and a little before that, arguably, but of what they call the one-time pad. And to this day, it's still one of the most secure encryption mechanisms, assuming the distribution of the pads are done correctly. And what do we mean by that? Well, the idea is that there's a pad of the code substitution and what we're going to do, but we're only going to use it one time for one message, and the other person at the other end will take their pad out. And we know every time we send a message, we tear off, we're done with that. I use it to encode, you use it to decode, and we get rid of it. Next time we have an entirely different cipher that we're going to use, so that at least over repeated runs, there is no chance to see a pattern develop within that, and do some of those types of things that might be able to help us break the code. But the problems that we have with that type is that we're still once again stuck with having to pre-share the key. And so the thing that the lesson ends with is something which is where we are today, the sort of modern algorithms. And we use basically what we call the public-private key pair combinations. And this is how modern cryptography works. I mean, if you think about it, how could we go to Amazon or our bank unless they gave us, like when we signed up to give you a piece of paper and say, keep this safe, this is the pass key to talk to our bank securely. Well, obviously, if that was being done that way, somebody's going to steal it or get it, and then crackers know the key and they can jump in and oversee, listen in on conversations and then reverse it and decrypt it. So we can't do that. And so this whole pre-sharing of stuff, if we were still stuck in that model, every bank would have to share with hundreds of thousands of customers a key or maybe a changing key so that they could connect securely to their website. That's not the way it works. What's happened is, thankfully, some very smart people, smarter than me, when it comes to the mathematics of cryptography. I kind of stick at the old school cipher breaking level, and I understand the new stuff, but I'm not that mathematically, it's some higher end math, right, that explains how this all works. But through the magic of this higher end math, what has been developed is this idea of we generate, and you guys and girls have already played with this. You've had to do like SSH. If you remember back in Network Foundations, you had to create keys. You had to leave the public one on your remote server, your Ubuntu virtual machine, and then you put the private key on your machine and set it up, either with the terminal by default on Mac, or had to go into Putty's menus and add that key, and then you could connect without having to log in with a password anymore. And we're even going to see later in the class that we can use that as a way to crack into something, when it's not securely set up right. And so this idea that when we create keys, we create a pair of keys. And actually, your browser does this for you. You don't even know it. It's happening in the background. Your browser creates basically a public and private key. And of course, Amazon has created or your bank or whoever, they've created a public-private key and have gone so far as to get that all signed by a third party to verify that it's them and their IP, and all that stuff is all tied into that digital certificate. And so what happens is, in public-private key encryption, is you give your public key to the other party, and they give you their public key. Each of you keep your own key. Your private keys private. You keep them secure somewhere on your own machine. In many cases, with the way that's being used in some of the same, these ID cards the military have, they have keys and encryption keys built onto them, these smart cards, so that they're basically carrying around their keys and they're encrypted on that device. And then when they swipe in, it makes a handshake and they can confirm the identity of that user. The public-private key pair, the way the math of all this works is, once you have somebody else's public key and they have your public key, you guys can set up a private communication that no one else can break. Because what happens is, when you want to send them a message, when you want to send stuff up to Amazon, you use your private key and their public key to come together mathematically to create, basically on the fly, in a sense, the algorithm that's going to encrypt and substitute and change and obfuscate all that content and turn it into ciphertext. And then the way the math works is when that person, that entity at the other end, and it could be, maybe I used to do this with friends just to learn how to do it, and used pretty good privacy to send each other encrypted emails. And we would each create a pair of keys, send each other our public. And then when you do that, you use your private and their public to encrypt. Only that person on the other end that has the private key that goes with the public one you use, and of course has your public key because that goes with your private key, can basically undo that. And so it becomes a very secure mechanism where we don't have to pre-share keys. I can go to a brand new company I've never been to before. My browser will send its public key. That company will send back their certificate, including their public key and their SSL certificate verifying their identity. Quickly, my browser will check with the third party, validate that that is true, and then we'll feel good about each other. So I'll trust their public key. They've got my public key. I use my private and their public to encrypt a message and send it to them. And then they use the reverse. They use their private and my public to decrypt it. And you know, it kind of makes sense. They're symmetrically related to each other, right? So it's like I'm not just encrypting with a cipher that anybody can figure out. I'm encrypting with a specific cipher that's tied to the recipient's private key. And when they send something back to me, they're encrypting using my public key and their private key. And then once again, since I have their public and my private, I'm the only person who can decrypt that. That's why one of the biggest weak links of that is if somebody can steal the keys. If they can get your keys, then they can decrypt the communication. But if the keys are secure at both ends, then even if somebody listens in at any hop along that path, they are not going to have any idea how to break that communication. And of course, we can have stronger and stronger bit counts, and that's becoming the norm to encrypt things, you know, at a much higher level because the computers are getting better at trying to figure this stuff out, right? So then when we move into lesson 3, we talk about the states of data. Since the very beginning, we've talked about our job in cybersecurity is to protect information assets, and all the information resources. So the raw information, the databases, the credit card information, our clients, our source code, all that, all the networking, all the equipment, all the servers, all the hard drives, everything that goes to build that, right? That's our job, is to protect that stuff, to protect the corporate information. And we have to protect it in what I've said multiple times, and it says in the chapters here and there, in the lessons here and there, in all of its forms. Well, when we talk about that, data can be in basically 3 states from our point of view in corporate IT. Data can be at rest. So the database, the file, the Word document, whatever, is just sitting there on a hard drive. It's just sitting there. It's at rest. Now, that's a great place where we can use encryption to encrypt. We can encrypt whole hard drives. We can encrypt backups and archives. We can do all kinds of things there. And that's a great way to help protect data at rest. We also, as we've already seen, and we use as an example, especially with this new PKI, public key infrastructure, public-private key model that we use in modern cryptography, we can protect data while it's in transit. So the data that I'm sending, my credit card information, my login, my orders, everything that I'm sending to Amazon, and all the confirmations and the shipping information, everything coming back at me, you know, from options, whatever that's coming back from Amazon, it's all being encrypted. And so we're encrypting the data in transit, another place that encryption really comes into use. The hardest place to protect data, and the place that I won't say it's impossible or isn't used, but it's just the harder one, is when data is in use. Okay, think about it. We can encrypt the backup. We can encrypt the hard drive so that the file is somebody gets in, hacker gets in, and pulls off our accounting file. Oh, it's encrypted. Sorry, dude, that didn't help you, did it? You can't read that. You don't have the right software. You don't know the right keys and the passcode to get into that file. Great, that was a good protection. We encrypt, you know, from the accountant's desktop back to the server, the information when they're putting in bills and new client information. That's all encrypted over the network, so nobody can just be snooping on the network, you know, snooping, trying to combine sniffing and snooping, I think. Snooping or whatever, sniffing on the network, so that, and then we don't want them to see that credit card information, right? So we protect it in transit. As a matter of fact, that's a requirement of the PCI DSS if we're talking credit card data, that the data must be encrypted at all stages, right? But the problem is that the reality is that once you get it into use, so I have now pulled up a record on the accountant's workstation. It's not encrypted. Our accountants can't read ciphertext, right? So at some point, in that moment of being used, I have a customer's record up on the screen and I'm going to update some information. That is unencrypted. And that's one of the weakest points, the hardest thing to deal with, because we can't. If nothing else, somebody could take a photo, take a screenshot, take that information, right? So even if it's being protected by encryption on the disk, encryption on the network, when it finally gets into use, it has to be unencrypted to be useful for most people, right? And so that becomes the weak link in the chain of protecting data at its different states. There's a number of things that are talked about in here, and different types of encryption. As we said, rest and motion are the best places to use encryption to protect data. But we talk about, data, some of the different authentications. We're beginning to start talking about how this fits into like multi-factor authentication and access control, because obviously that's what cryptography is about. If you log in, usually that's some form of encryption to protect that information from your being transmitted across the network. And in many cases, like Windows Active Directory, Kerberos, different types of things, which we'll talk some about these in the coming lessons, and some you may already know about. But any kind of authentication, many times when you log into that network, you're then given basically a digital token that you can then use. This validates that you've logged in and you have a valid session. And now you can continue to ask for other services on the network. You can see that in the sense of like how when we had to do SQL map and we needed that PHP session cookie, that was a not an encryption value, but still it was something that we were using, a token that was being passed every time we made a transaction between the web server and the web client to maintain the fact that that's the same user. And just like we were able to snag that, obviously, if we can snag some of these other tokens, then we might be able to use them. There's a famous hack, if you will, called them pass the hash, which is because Windows networking, somebody logs in, there are potential ways to grab the hash value of that authentication token they're using to log into the next server and the printer and whatever they're using. And then if that can be snagged, then we can pass that in. We don't even have to encrypt it. We just say, oh, we managed to, they've logged in on this machine and then we've captured that token, that hash, we can pass it to another service, and now we get authentication as if we were them because we're using that token. So there's all different kinds of potential weaknesses still, even with the best encryption we have, but we have to be aware of those things. And of course, we've covered some and we'll cover more as we go on. And so then the lesson 3 ends up with, well, it talks a little bit more about risk assessment. And we talked about that in the beginning class. Haven't really come back to it again, but in this context, it's very important. As you start talking about access controls, just like we want to do a risk assessment in general, as part of setting up an organization's security policy. And I use those examples way back in Intro to Security Foundations of, yeah, both companies A and B have a website, but A makes a butt ton of money from their website, and B just has their menu up on the restaurant, right? And how to come see us. And so these folks are going to spend a lot more, and they're going to risk, their risk assessment is going to show that their risk of impact is much higher, right? Their business impact, if that site goes down, than these guys are. So they're going to respond with, hot site backups and other possible things. And these folks are going to have a copy of their web page and stick it up on another provider if it goes down, or if somebody hacks it, then they'll just overwrite it. It's not, they don't view it as much, so they haven't spent as much. When you start looking at access controls, we have to use some of our principles again. Like in general, we want to limit access. Remember the old limiting back from lesson 6 of Intro to Security Foundations? The concept of limiting, giving the least amount of access possible, is one that should guide you. But then risk assessment, like, okay, I'm going to have, every time I give somebody access to the system, I'm increasing the risk to the system, right? More people could get in, more people could make a mistake, more people could turn malicious, more people's machines could get hacked and that access used. Crypto virus gets in and spreads wild through the network, right? So we have to manage, we have to look at risk again in this context as we understand, how much, what is our risk? Are we going to encrypt everything in multiple layers all over the place, or only certain critical files? So we're going to use risk analysis to decide how we're going to use encryption. And then it's definitely also going to illuminate how we set up our access control policies and procedures. Obviously, to just give everybody full admin access is easy, right? That's once again that security to convenience trade-off. not very secure, but hecka convenient. But of course, if we give access to nobody, then we go too far. We don't provide the availability that we need to, and our company fails. So we have to find that middle ground. And where we find it for our organization is conducting risk assessments. And so we can look at, okay, what are the risks of if I give the salespeople too much data, if I give the marketing people too much access, what are the risks? And we can look at that as a broad, corporate wide. We can look at it specifically to each group or each user. What are the risks of if we give them this? They have to have this. Might need this, and we're not giving them that. But here in this middle, where are we going to draw the lines on our access control policy? How much are we going to share, and how much are we not? And so risk management comes back into the fore. Lesson 4, we've hit on some of this. It's a little different material, different take, a different author actually of this course. And so good to review, but a lot of this, many of you probably know, and we've talked about some of it a little bit before, the various standards though, and the standard body that deal with wireless security. You could sum up, don't use WPA, ideally use WPA2, and then ideally use the enterprise version for your organization and some other form of, authentication. And there are, even with the newest version, there's already some known potential cracks out there, which, it's just sad, but they'll work forward. But I think one of the neatest things is in that lesson, we introduce you, which is to the concept of some made up people called Alice and Bob. And Alice and Bob are wanting to have a communication with each other, and they want to keep it secure. And so it's a neat analogy and a story of how basically this public key, private key infrastructure works. And so I'll leave you to read that, and you'll actually see Alice and Bob again a little later in one of the other chapters as we review some of this and add a little bit more to it. But it's a neat explanation for how this works and how the whole public key, private key infrastructure works. So then the last lesson for the first half of the course is we begin to shift out of the pure cryptography, history, basics, ciphers, public key, private key, wireless, and various forms, and that we've talked about up to this point, and we begin to shift gears into the access management part of the class. And so what is access management? Well, it's the management of access. It's the managing access to your network and to the resources of your network, and by definition to the information that those resources contain, right? So we have to give people access to corporate resources to do their job. But we have to use that limiting concept of only giving people what they need to do their job. We don't want to get lazy and just everybody gets access to all of this. Obviously, we don't want to do that at an admin level. We don't even want to do it at a smaller level. Like, a lot of times I've seen companies, for example, and maybe there's a reason to have one of these, and you just take the risk. But I've seen companies, it's like, okay, well, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to give salespeople access to the sales database and accounting people access to the accounting database, and we're not going to let that cross. But we're going to have this big common shared folder that everybody in the company gets access to, so that we make sure everybody can share with everybody. Okay, well, that's great. And then until you put some critical stuff up on there, and then one machine gets infected with a crypto virus, and that whole share gets encrypted. And so now everybody's impacted, right? So maybe you might have a place on the network where there is just everybody can read and write, but maybe you have policy that says this is just, for temporary transfer. This files are cleaned up out of here and archived or deleted. Don't put anything in here super critical, whatever. You need to get this file over to somebody you don't normally have connectivity with or a direct share with because you're in a different department, and we want to, that happens. I've worked at companies, and even though most of the time when I was in, say, customer support engineering training department, that side of the team, the engineering side, we all worked together and we had similar rights, and we could share stuff with each other, and that was all cool. And maybe we're on a VLAN, right? And then, of course, over here, the other departments, we can't see them, HR and the other stuff. But, there might have been a company event and a company training, a company annual conference, whatever. And so I'm providing a piece of resource that's going into a PowerPoint that's being done by a marketing person. And so they don't have access to my resources. I don't have access to theirs. Obviously, if it's a small enough file, I could just email it to them, right? Use that, and that's common. But, we did have a share that was sort of this public share. so that you could do things like that, facilitate. But it was pretty restricted, and you didn't see it just filling up with lots of stuff because it was managed by IT for that reason. We didn't want it to become the dependent place. We didn't want some critical spreadsheet that if these people really needed to have a connection, then we would make them a special share and only give access to those 3 trainers and 3 marketing people, and they're on this project together. And that way, the risk of that project being messed up, accidentally or on purpose, was minimized, right? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about access control, is we are talking about how are we going to manage people getting access to printers, to servers, to data, to shares, to everything on our network. And of course, there are all different kinds of mechanisms for that. And of course, it talks conceptually about how there's some processes. We generally speaking need to identify the person as they come on, or the device, if it's a device. We need to identify them. Then we need to authenticate that that is actually who we think they are. And then based on that authentication, then we ultimately authorize them to do something. And that's where, we may have multi-steps in this process. Somebody logs in, and thus, we now see their username, so they're identifying themselves. Well, how are we going to authenticate that? In the most simple system, it's a password. So they're challenged. The user provides a password as well. So now we have identified and authenticated that that is the user. And of course, we can use multi-factor, have a code on their phone. So we have a secondary PIN, 2-factor authentication. We could have biometrics, scan your eyeball, whatever the case is. But that's the processes we go through. We identify. It's either by username or swiping a card. Then we're also being challenged for, or as part of that process. Many times, of course, we fill in username and password at one step, but that really is where we're saying, here, I'm this person, and I'm proving that that's who I am. So I'm authenticating. But then at that point, how much rights do you have? Well, your rights is where the access management comes in. Once we've identified and authorized and authenticated somebody, then we have to then provide authorization. So is that just a login to that machine? That's one model, right? Is that a login to a broader system, something like that Windows Active Directory system, or Kerberos, or lightweight access directory protocol, LDAP, lightweight directory access protocol. There we go. Let's get that right before. And so where we can log in once we're authenticated against the network, then we have rights. And so that system can tell us, and let us know. So we connect, like on Windows, the way it works is you have an Active Directory kind of domain, Windows network, a corporate networking situation. When you log in, you're not just logging into that local computer, you're logging into the domain. You're logging into the entire network, basically. And the Active Directory controller will validate your user authentication and then give you your authorization. And of course, one of those is, yes, I can get a desktop and I'm on this machine now. So now I'm on this computer, but I also have rights on the network that have signed to my authenticated account. So I might be able to print to the printer in this floor, but not the plotter over there. I might be able to have access to a small public share and my own department share, but not other shares. I might be able to connect, and obviously if I'm in the accounting department, I'm going to have rights. There's going to be a shared drive, a map over, so I can pull that QuickBooks or that Peachtree or that SAP or whatever my Oracle accounting software is. And I'm going to have access to that data, but I'm not going to have access to the engineering department's data. And so that's what access control is all about, is defining that stuff, setting that up, and putting in place the mechanisms to make it happen. And so, of course, there are a lot of different levels of access you can give. Of course, the level that is attackers or even the pen testers we might want to shoot for is root, right? We won't super use it. We want full power so we can do anything. And that definitely is the goal of an outside attacker in many cases. But of course, and we do need those users. We need administrative users on our network. And in many cases, it's very likely that we in our field will have some degree of admin level rights to work on systems and to secure systems and do things, depending on what exact role we take. We may not have any rights. If we're a pen tester, we may have to make them ourselves. Put that aside. The idea is that, that's all set up. And there's that super user is one of the right types. And then, of course, there's just read permission. People can just read this data. People can read and write to this data. People can create, we can set up all kinds, and each operating system has slightly different ways to do it. Generally, we can do it by group, right? We can set up groups of users, so we can assign rights to the group so that everybody gets those rights, so that it makes it easier for us to administer instead of having to go in every time we hire a new person in the accounting department and go into that person's individual authentication record in the system and basically give them rights to couple different folders and a couple different servers and a couple different databases. We can drag them into the accounting group, and the accounting group has that. But then again, we even then might need multiple groups, right? We might need kind of an accounting managers group where they get even a higher level. I've seen companies break, and it's very common actually, to break the accounting into two, the AR side and the AP side, the accounts receivable and the accounts payable, so that you have people who are responsible for sending out bills and taking money in, and that's what they do. And you have people who are responsible for receiving bills like from your vendors and paying those. But those sides don't actually have access to the other because you get keys to the whole, candy store, so to speak, there. And so there's different ways that, access control systems can be used, groups can be set up and managed. And of course, a lot of this comes down to tying into corporate policy. We will have policies that dictate in our security policy. We'll have guidelines potentially that we've written, and then ultimately policies that say, a new hire at this level, they get this stuff. They get access to a local server. They get access to certain things. They get access to based on the team. They're going to be assigned to the sales group. An engineer is going to have an entirely different set of rights and permissions. So there may be a different document or a different section of the same document describing what that typical set of rights and permissions is for that user. So we're not just willy-nilly every time we hire somebody going, oh, what do they need? Okay, let's give them that. No, we have policy. We have guidelines to follow on how we're going to usually set up templates in the system. Many companies will have onboarding templates. So when they hire somebody, then it's very easy. They know exactly, what they're going to do. Oh, it's a new sales employee. Well, then I'll take their sales template, copy it, give it that person's name, Bob Smith, and then all of a sudden we drag him into the sales group, and now we've created a user with the basic shares and the basic rights they need. And of course, we can customize if need be from there, as we go on. And then the chapter continues to talk a little bit about just sort of touching on some things we're familiar with. There's a little bit more in this about disaster recovery, business continuity planning. They were talked a little bit about, of course, in the beginning course. So this comes back a little bit here. And then as we go on into next week, we're going to, that would be the wrong notes. We're not going to go back to the intro to cryptography, sorry. We're going to go into risk management and talk a little bit more about risk management next week. We're going to talk about different types of access control systems, and there are some different models, not surprising, some acronyms we need to learn and memorize in case we take Security Plus or whatever. And then we're going to talk a little bit more in Lesson 8 about securing data in the 3 states, as well as then implementing access control protocols, and talking a little bit as well in 9 about remote access. That's a subset, obviously, of access control. And we need to really be aware of that one. It's one thing to set up access controls when somebody sits down at the corporate computer and logs in, and then they get rights on the network and they're ostensibly inside. But of course, more and more companies are supporting, myself included, we're remote workers. So we have to have access to sometimes the network, our facilities, or be able to share, get into databases, repos, whatever the case is. And so managing that is critically important, so that, because we were opening a remote access method. So there's some stuff we'll talk about that. And then as a kind of a wrap up, and sort of closes back a little bit on encryption, but it also is still in the access control, because as I said, this all ties together. Today in the modern world, we don't use ciphers anymore generally. We use public-private key encryption. So to use that within a corporate setup as a way to do access control, then you have to start adding some additional things to your network potentially, or at least outsource these. And these are like certificate servers. So for example, if you're going to issue your people digital certificates, public and private keys, or you're even going to have the people generate them, but somebody's got to, something's got to be a repository of these so we can manage the keys. And when somebody disappears, leaves the company, we can deactivate keys. If you think about what's happened with that trick of the SSH key let's log in to the Ubuntu that you did in Network Foundations, you were able to create a public and private key. You left the public one on the server and you had your private one on your remote client. Of course, it's only a hop away on your virtual machine, but the principle is exactly what you would do if you were doing that up, say, in the Amazon cloud or working from remote and connecting to a server on your corporate network. If you were using keys, then of course that's what's happened. Is that way when you try to log in, you basically cryptography, are able to verify mathematically that you have the private key that goes with that public key, that you are the person that's the other side of that, and thus you're able to log in and be validated. Of course, if that key changes, then we have to update those keys on the servers and on the individual machines. And so that's what lesson 10 is about, is the infrastructure, PKI, public key infrastructure, that is necessary. So it ends up wrapping up the lesson pretty well, bringing back a little bit more about cryptography and Alice and Bob at some point in those lessons, later part, as well as the actual equipment and things that we need to do to make that happen. So that's it for today. That's the first 5 lessons. So all the cryptography basics, and then getting into the first of access management. If you have any questions, of course, hit me up on Slack. As a reminder, if you haven't, and I don't think a couple of you in this class have, please respond to that email so I can set up our one-on-one reviews. I'm going to be doing some of those tonight in the next couple of days. I want to get them done here in the next couple of days because I need to do one a week, and we'll have to do it again next week. We'll see you next week. Thanks.